Hi guys, welcome back once again to the channel. Today we are going to be talking about... And let me ask you a question, and be honest with yourself. How did you pronounce this name just now? Now I'm going to give you 10 seconds and give it a little thought about how it should have been pronounced, okay? So, count. Well, if you pronounce the name like
Penderecki. You wrecky my ears.
probably that's not the right one because it's Polish. Even though I do not speak Polish personally, I have a great friend who does. She is a professional Polish speaker. So, off to you, Alicja.
Krzysztof Penderecki.
Alicja is a fantastic violinist and a great friend that I had the opportunity of meeting back in 2013 at the Lucerne Festival Academy. We performed on quite a few concerts together, and funnily enough, the last encounter that I had with her was in the previously mentioned Delian Academy for New Music, where she was performing as part of the Zone Experimental Ensemble. It was one of the ensembles in residence at the Academy, and sadly I wasn't writing for her, but just putting it out there, Alicja, you know, I would love to write for you anytime, anywhere. Alicja also has a YouTube channel right over here, so remember to go and visit her and subscribe to her. Back to the subject of today. We will be talking about Krzysztof Penderecki's Threnody to the Victims of Hiroshima. And by now I think we all know that we have lost a great master, a real living legend, and a musical giant of our time, Krzysztof Penderecki. He is a Polish composer born in 1933 in the town of Delbica. He was born to a non-musical family but was brought up musically at a relatively young age. He moved to Kraków in 1951 after the war and received musical education at the Kraków Music Academy. And of course, Penderecki was best known for receiving international renown at the 1959 Warsaw Autumn Festival, because like many contemporary music festivals, there are calls for compositions. This particular call for composition was an anonymous one. Penderecki submitted 3 compositions, which were Strophen for soprano, speaker and 10 instruments, Psalms of David for mixed choir, strings and percussion, and Emanation for 2 string orchestras. When the jury revealed the results and checked who the composer of the pieces selected were, they found out that all the 3 pieces were by Penderecki. Penderecki became famous overnight and received a lot of international attention. But today we are going to be talking about one of his most famous / infamous pieces because of its shocking qualities upon first hearing. It is the Threnody to the Victims of Hiroshima for 52 strings. But before we dive into the piece, let's take a look at Penderecki's stylistic characteristics. Penderecki's style can be broadly divided into 2 major periods. The first is the more experimental phase, and one of the features is the extensive use of unusual playing techniques, whereas the second, what we can broadly call neo-romantic period, features extensive use of traditional tonal harmonies. The Threnody, of course, belongs to the first phase and is one of the more mature works of the first period. The unfortunate thing is that the music from his experimental period is often associated with horror films, and if you have seen this
Here's Johnny!
You would have heard quite a few of Penderecki's pieces, but it's important to experience the music in itself and for itself without the external associations attached to the music. We'll come back to this point later because it has to do with the title and the music of the Threnody. Now, the Threnody might sound like a very alien or very strange piece upon first hearing because of its use of tone clusters, banging the instrument, playing in unusual places, creating unusual resonances. If we look beyond the surface shocking quality of the music, we can find the same underlying mode of thinking as the one that we can find in, for example, a Mahler symphony. The way he controls tone color and how he contrasts tone color from one section to the other is actually very reminiscent of how many traditional composers from previous centuries write their music. And if we're able to really listen carefully to the music rather than just hearing it in passing, we can actually find that there is a wickedly humorous human being underneath or behind the music. In this way, it is very different from most of the stereotypical serial music of the 50s or the 60s, where all you hear are calculations and pre-planned constructions. This is absolutely not the case with the music of Penderecki. So, for example, if you listen to the Natura Sonoris number 1, Capriccio for violin and orchestra, or even the Partita for harpsichord and orchestra, you hear that he is actually poking fun at the listeners and playing with our expectations of how he would be taking the next step. In this sense, I find his music much more approachable than even a lot of music by Schoenberg, for instance. So now let's dive in and take a look at the Threnody to the Victims of Hiroshima. The Threnody is practically a notation manual for notating extended techniques for young composers, because like many masters who have developed a very systematized way of notating extended techniques like Bergführer or Helmut Lachmann, of course, Penderecki has his own system of notation symbols that accurately depicts what the action should be on the instrument and what the resulting sound should be. The piece is called Threnody to the Victims of Hiroshima, and the title has an almost melodramatic quality about it. And having this image before you hear the piece itself actually frames the listener's perception and sometimes draws unnecessary associations, because the original title of the Threnody is actually called 8 minutes 37 seconds. And if you think that the name sounds remotely familiar to another piece by a certain American composer called John Cage, then you are absolutely right. He himself said that he wanted to, in a way, liberate music from all known conventions. The sound world of the piece also is very reminiscent of the experimental electronic music at the time. And if we take a look at the footage here, we can see that Penderecki, like many composers of the time, were very interested in sound experiments in electronic studios, and here you can see that he is actually experimenting with a vocalist in an electronic music studio, manipulating the sound waves on the machine. If we take this into context, we can see that the Threnody, or rather 8 minutes 37 seconds, is actually a piece that explores the sonic qualities of a string orchestra in a very purist way. We can roughly divide the piece into two halves. The first half is where Penderecki uses mostly a kind of semi-aleatoric proportional notation, whereas in the second half, Penderecki actually returns to a more contrapuntal and almost traditional way of writing that is more emblematic of the time. So without further ado, let's take a quick look at the score of the Threnody. I wouldn't be doing a page-by-page analysis because it would be quite boring, but we can very, very roughly divide the piece into quite a few sections in terms of the way the music is notated. So if we look at the score, page 1 to 6, page 8, and page 15 and page 16, this is where Penderecki wrote the music in a kind of proportional notation. The use of proportional notation yields very interesting results, because by using this kind of notation, the composer is suggesting that he wants a relative and almost objective position of the musical event in time, rather than fixing it with conventional notation so that the music sounds the same every time. So if we look at the first system of the first page, we can see that he notated very clearly he wanted the first group of the viola to come first, followed by the first group of the violins, followed by the contrabassi, etc., etc. But he is not interested in pinning down exactly when and where the musical events appear. And so in that sense, he is giving a tiny bit of freedom to the interpreters, and mostly in this case the conductor. The next interesting thing, of course, is in page 2, where he uses a kind of notation that lists out all the extended techniques each performer of each group is supposed to play. Sometimes certain extended techniques don't connect well from one to the other. By using this particular kind of notation, he is suggesting that he's not concerned about the speed at which the techniques are executed, but rather he is interested in, again, listing out the order in which the extended technique should be played at. This again gives freedom to each performer, because what one performer finds easy to play might be very difficult for another performer. He's not interested in having unity at this point. He's interested in having the same list of extended techniques being played by different people at different speed. That creates a kind of almost chaotic texture, but a kind of controlled chaos. Now we hop onto the 4th and 5th page. We can see a very strange kind of notation where he uses 3 staffs. This kind of notation is interesting because it gives a very clear outline of the global effect required by the gesture. So the first violin is supposed to go up, and the 12th violin is supposed to go down, and everybody in between is supposed to fill the gap. If we skip ahead to page 16, this is where we really feel the full power of this particular notation. We can see that there's this super thick black bar that crosses both staffs. This is a very stunning visual representation of the sonic result that the music is going to produce. And now we arrive at probably the most complex section of the Threnody. And if we look at the music, this is the very first time where Penderecki employed traditional metered notation. This section is very reminiscent of the quasi-serial writing that is very much archetypal of the 50s and 60s. And if you want something for comparison's sake, we can take a look at, for example, Xenakis' Metastasis from 1954. Or Boulez's Livre Cocotte from 1968. But unlike many of the serial pieces of the time, which are really complex in their construction, this section here is actually very transparent in the way it was laid out. In many of Penderecki's work, we'll find that even if the material looks new in the way they are being presented, they are actually very traditional and use a lot of conventional formal structures. For example, here in this section, Penderecki is actually writing a canon/fugue using non-conventional sounds produced on the instrument. The first group that comes in at measure 26 presents almost like the fugal subject in its first incarnation, and then the second group comes in at measure 38. It's actually the exact inversion of the materials that are being played by the first group at measure 36. Even if it's basically the same music, the fact that it's being inverted in its orchestration creates a completely different sound picture. The complexity is not a result of the way Penderecki writes the music, but in the way he lays it out with his orchestration. The third group that comes in at measure 44 is actually using materials from group 2 in measure 42. And the fact that the third group comes in with a sort of truncated fugal subject further confuses the ear perception and creates a kind of illusion of non-repetition, whereas in fact it's simply the same material being played over and over again. The fact that the material itself is sufficiently complex, we are not able to grasp the complete image of the material, and that's why we think that it's complex, and that's why we don't recognize it when it's being repeated. The same can be said of page 2, where Penderecki again offers a more complex treatment of the material. First group that comes in at measure 50 and 55 is a direct rhythmic mirror of the materials played by group 2 in measure 42 and 47. And here the first group is kind of like a separate entity from group 2s and 3, because groups 2 and 3 are operating continuously in a kind of quasi-canonical manner, whereas the first section is actually going its own direction. Group 2 at measure 50 and 57 is a material inversion of what group 1 played in measure 35 to 45. Group 3, again in canon with group 2, with this entry from measure 52, is a transposed version of the material from measure 50 to 57 in group 2. Here we see that again Penderecki is very economically using one single piece of complex material, but then pulling it apart and then cutting it up and reassembling it and creating the grand illusion that the music is evolving all the time, but actually it's simply the same piece of material being picked apart and reassembled in different ways. Now on page 14 to 15 we see the first appearance and only appearance of two playing techniques, which are playing the tailpiece and playing the bridge. And Penderecki used these two techniques only on the largest instruments of the orchestra, the cello and the basses, because these two playing techniques are only effective in the context of this section over here, where three groups of violins, violas and cellos are playing vertical loud gestures, and the violins are starting to seep in on the top with that high register cluster. And this bowing of the tailpiece and the bridge gives a very weird kind of resonance on the instrument, and therefore produces a very strange kind of haunting sonority. And of course the piece recaps with a slightly more familiar texture, where he uses extreme vibratos, creating a kind of almost wailing kind of sound effect. Lots of tremoli, lots of clusters, and then ending on this massive 52 note chord that is being held continuously for 30 seconds, which coincidentally is the longest duration indicated on the duration line on the bottom of the score throughout the piece. This brings the piece to conclusion, and really I think this is a tremendously courageous piece that explores previously unheard of combinations, instrumental and timbral combinations. Again, it is very evident that, like many composers of the time, this piece is the result of extensive experiments with electronic music. We know that, for instance, Ligeti went to Cologne to work with Stockhausen and Kagel in the WDR experimental studio, and a lot of the ideas that he wasn't initially able to realize in the electronic studio eventually went on to become his orchestral masterpieces, for example, Atmospheres or Lontano. The same is true of Penderecki in his earlier phase. I hope you enjoy this video. This video is dedicated to the memory of a great master, because I think, like many people, my first encounter with the music of Penderecki was the Threnody. It's a very unforgettable experience. The initial shock of hearing it is quite refreshing. I also wanted to take the opportunity to debunk the fact that his music is not exclusively related to horror films, as most people think it is, but they are really fruits of his tireless experimentation and a very courageous artist attempting to redefine the aesthetics of the time. What I find truly admirable about Penderecki is that even though he is practically branded as the figurehead of the post-war avant-garde, he decided to stick to his guts and change his style to a more tonal writing, which many people took quite personally and thought it was a betrayal, because he started this whole avant-garde thing but then abandoned it midway. But I think many great minds in history also had this kind of conflict, and if you look at Wittgenstein, who wrote practically two philosophies during his life, two contradicting philosophies at that, we can see that fundamentally they are being true to themselves, because they found that there is something wrong or insufficient about the way he approached the problem the first time. So he decided to use a different solution to approach the problem, which is equally valid. So I hope this video has been interesting, and if you stayed till here, please comment down there and let me know what you think. Like the video and subscribe if you haven't done it, and I'll see you in the next video. So thanks a lot and see you. Bye bye.